What would you do if you had to face your darkest nightmares to save the world? Get ready to dive into Emily's epic battle against the forces of shadows. Full moon hovered over the Shadowgrove forest, its silver light barely penetrating the dense canopy of ancient trees. Emily, now 16 years old, felt the weight of the world on her shoulders as she walked alongside Liam, faithful protector and friend. The air was charged with a sinister energy, causing the hairs on the back of her neck to stand up. "Can you feel that, Liam?" Emily whispered, her brown eyes scanning the shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Liam nodded gravely, his hand instinctively going to the leather pouch hanging from his belt, full of protective amulets he had created himself. "Yes, the rift in the veil is near. Remember what Mrs. Winters taught us, Em?" They focused. Emily closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath to calm her nerves. Since discovering her powers, she had been training tirelessly with Mrs. Winters, an experienced guardian, but nothing could have fully prepared her for what they were about to face. As they advanced deeper into the forest, reality seemed to distort around them. Shadows danced at the periphery of their vision, and impossible sounds echoed among the trees. Distorted laughter, whispers in forgotten languages, the scraping of claws against bark. Suddenly, Emily stopped, her wide eyes fixed on a point ahead. "There," she murmured, pointing to a clearing where the air seemed to ripple like heat over asphalt on a hot day. Liam followed her gaze and swallowed hard. The rift in the veil was visible now, a crack in reality itself that pulsed with evil energy. Around it, shadows twisted and clustered, as if eager to escape into the world of the living. "We need to close it," Emily said, her voice trembling slightly, before more of those things managed to get through. Liam nodded, already beginning to trace a protection circle around them with salt and herbs. "I'll do my best to keep them away while you work on the rift. Remember, Em, you're stronger than them. You were born for this." Emily tried to smile. The fear in her eyes was evident. She stepped forward, raising her hands towards the rift. Concentrating, she began to channel her power, visualizing the edges of reality closing. At first, it seemed to be working. The rift flickered, beginning to close slowly. But then, as if responding to a silent call, the shadows around the clearing came to life. Nightmare creatures emerged from the darkness with humanoid and distorted forms, with limbs too long and faces that were just black holes from which silent screams echoed. They advanced towards Emily and Liam, their intentions clearly hostile. "Emily, watch out!" Liam shouted, pulling an amulet from his pouch and raising it. The talisman glowed with a golden light, causing the nearest creatures to recoil with hisses of pain. Emily turned, panic threatening to overwhelm her, as she saw the army of shadows surrounding them. She raised her hands, channeling her power to push the creatures away. But there were too many. For every shadow she dispersed, two more seemed to take its place. It was then that something inside her changed. Primordial instinct, buried deep in her being, awakened. Without thinking, Emily reached out to one of the shadow creatures, and instead of pushing it away, she pulled it towards her. The sensation was indescribable. It was as if she were drinking darkness itself. Creature's power flowed into her, cold and electrifying. For a moment, Emily felt invincible. "Emily," Liam's voice brought her back to reality. "What are you doing?" She looked at her own hands, now wrapped in an aura of undulating darkness. I don't know," she answered, her voice sounding strange even to her own ears. "But I think I can use this." With a battle cry, Emily launched herself against the shadow creatures. Her new powers made her faster, stronger. She danced among the enemies, her form almost merging with the shadows around her. Liam watched, a mixture of admiration and fear in his eyes. He continued to use his amulets to maintain a protective perimeter, but it was Emily who was really making the difference. As the battle intensified, Emily absorbed more and more creatures. Each absorption made her more powerful, but she also felt something changing inside her. A growing darkness, a desire for more power that threatened to consume her. The battle in the Shadowgrove clearing reached its peak. Emily, now wrapped in an aura of pulsating darkness, faced the shadow creatures with a ferocity that bordered on the supernatural. Her movements were fluid, almost hypnotic, as she danced among the enemies, absorbing them one after another. Liam, still maintaining the protection circle, watched with a mixture of admiration and growing concern. "Emily," he shouted over the chaos of the battle, "don't lose yourself. Remember who you are." For a moment, Emily seemed not to hear him. Completely immersed in the frenzy of the fight, Her eyes, once a warm brown, now glowed with a supernatural blue, reflecting the power of the shadows she had absorbed. "I'm fine, Liam," she finally responded, her voice carrying a strange echo. "I've never felt so strong." But Liam could see the change in her. With each creature absorbed, the glow in her eyes intensified, and her expression became colder, more distant. He knew he needed to do something before it was too late. Meanwhile, the rift in the veil pulsed threateningly, expanding with each moment. From its depths, an ethereal and evil voice echoed, making the surrounding trees tremble. "Yes, young guardian," the voice whispered, audible only to Emily. "Absorb more. Become stronger. Join us in the darkness." Emily hesitated, her hands trembling slightly. For an instant, she felt the weight of the power she had accumulated, the temptation to simply surrender to it. Realizing the danger, Liam acted on instinct. Breaking the protection circle, he ran towards Emily, brandishing his most powerful amulet. "Em," he shouted, his voice laden with emotion. "You're stronger than this. Remember who you are, why we're here." Liam's words seemed to pierce the fog of power that enveloped Emily. She blinked, her eyes momentarily returning to their familiar brown. "Liam?" she murmured, confused. I don't know what's happening to me." Taking advantage of Emily's moment of lucidity, Liam advanced, determined to reach her. But the shadow creatures, sensing Emily's hesitation, attacked with renewed vigor. A wave of darkness rose between Liam and Emily, separating them. Liam fought against the black tide, his amulets glowing intensely, creating a path through the shadows. "Emily," he shouted again, "close the rift. Only you can do it." Liam's words seemed to awaken something in Emily. Fighting against the influence of the shadows within her, she turned to the rift. With a cry of determination, she channeled all the power she had absorbed. The clearing was flooded with an intense blue light emanating from Emily. The shadow creatures howled in agony, dissolving in the light. The rift in the veil trembled, its edges beginning to close. "No," the voice of the shadows roared. "You belong to us now." Emily felt the shadows within her fighting, trying to take control. She staggered, almost yielding to the darkness. It was then that she felt a hand on her shoulder. Liam was by her side, his face determined and his eyes full of confidence. "You can do it, Em," he said softly. "I'm here with you. Always." With one last effort, Emily pushed all the power of the shadows into the rift. There was a deafening sound, like the tearing of the very fabric of reality. Then, silence. The rift closed with a final flash of light. The shadows dissipated, leaving only the normal night forest in their place. Emily fell to her knees, exhausted and trembling. Liam immediately wrapped her in his arms, holding her as she cried, releasing all the accumulated tension and fear. "It's over," he murmured, caressing her hair. "You did it, Em. You saved us all." But as Emily snuggled into Liam's arms, she couldn't ignore the lingering sensation of darkness within her. She had closed the rift, yes, but at what cost? What would these new shadows inside her mean for her future? The days that followed the battle in the Shadowgrove forest were a whirlwind of emotions and uncertainties for Emily. Although she and Liam had returned as heroes, being received with relief and gratitude by Mrs. Winters, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed inside her. In her moments of solitude, she could feel the shadows stirring within her, like a distant echo of a power she barely understood. At night, her dreams were populated by unsettling visions, distorted landscapes of a shadow realm, and whispering voices that promised secrets and power beyond her imagination. A week after the incident, Emily found herself in Mrs. Winters' cozy office. The room was illuminated by the soft glow of aromatic candles, and the walls were lined with ancient books and mystical artifacts. Mrs. Winters, a middle-aged woman with graying hair and wise eyes, observed Emily with a mixture of concern and curiosity. "How are you feeling, dear?" Mrs. Winters asked, her voice gentle but carrying an underlying tension. Emily hesitated, nervously playing with the edge of her blouse. I'm not sure," she finally admitted. "Sometimes I feel normal, like before. But other times..." Mrs. Winters leaned forward, her eyes fixed on Emily. "Other times? It's like there's something inside me," Emily continued, her voice almost a whisper. "Something dark and powerful. And sometimes I want to use it." Mrs. Winters sighed deeply, getting up to retrieve an ancient book from one of the shelves. "Emily, what you did in the forest was extraordinary," she said, flipping through the yellowed pages. "But also extremely dangerous. Absorbing the shadows, it's an ability we haven't seen in centuries." Emily felt a shiver run down her spine. What does that mean? Have I become something bad? Mrs. Winters smiled gently, placing a comforting hand on Emily's shoulder. No, dear, you haven't become something bad, but you now carry within you a power that can be both a blessing and a curse. It will all depend on how you choose to use it. At that moment, there was a knock on the door, and Liam entered, his face lighting up at the sight of Emily. He had been constantly by her side since the battle, his unwavering support an anchor amid Emily's emotional storm. Sorry to interrupt, Liam said, noticing the serious atmosphere in the room. But I thought you should know. There's been another attack. Mrs. Winters stood up abruptly, her expression becoming grave. Where? In the neighboring town, Liam replied, his gaze alternating between Mrs. Winters and Emily. Witnesses reported shadow creatures attacking people in the streets. It's as if the rift hadn't really been closed, Emily completed, feeling a weight settle in her stomach. Mrs. Winters walked to the window, looking at the darkening sky outside. I'm afraid it's worse than that, she said softly. Emily, when you absorbed the shadows, you didn't just close the rift. You became a bridge between our world and the shadow realm. Emily felt the blood freeze in her veins. What does that mean? Mrs. Winters turned, her eyes meeting Emily's with an intensity that made the young woman tremble. It means, my dear, that the battle is far from over. In fact, it has only just begun, and you, Emily, are at the center of it all. Liam stepped forward, placing himself protectively beside Emily. What can we do? Mrs. Tuff Winters retrieved an amulet from a nearby drawer, handing it to Emily. First, we need to better understand what's happening. Emily, you'll have to learn to control this new power. And fast. Because if you don't, the shadows will, Emily completed, feeling the weight of responsibility fall on her shoulders. Mrs. Winters nodded gravely. Exactly. And if that happens, the veil between worlds could rupture completely, releasing horrors we can't even imagine. Emily looked at Liam, seeing the determination in his eyes, and then back to Mrs. Winters. I'll do whatever it takes, said, her voice firm despite the fear she felt. I won't let the shadows win. In the weeks that followed, Emily immersed herself in intense training under Mrs. Winters' tutelage. The attic of the old mansion that served as the Guardian's headquarters was transformed into a practice room, protected by powerful containment spells. Emily spent hours every day in that space, learning to channel and control the power of the shadows that now resided within her. It was an exhausting and often frightening process. Each time she touched that inner darkness, she felt as if she were on the edge of an abyss about to fall. Focus, Emily, Mrs. Winters' voice echoed in the attic. Don't fight the shadows, accept them, guide them. Emily closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. She could feel the power pulsing in her veins, yearning to be released. Carefully, she extended her consciousness, touching that shadowy energy. Immediately, visions flooded her mind. Creatures writhing in darkness, alien landscapes of a world without light, and at the center of it all, an ancient and evil presence, watching, waiting. Emily gasped, almost losing control. But then she felt a hand on her shoulder. Liam, always present, always supporting. You can do it, Em, whispered. I believe in you. With supreme effort, Emily channeled the power of the shadows, molding it with her will. The darkness around her solidified, forming ethereal figures that danced at her command. Mrs. Winters watched with a mixture of pride and concern. Impressive, Emily, she said. But remember, the real challenge is not just controlling the power, but resisting its temptation. Emily nodded, dissipating the shadows with a gesture. She knew all too well what Mrs. Winters was talking about. With each passing day, she felt the power growing within her, promising her things she didn't even know she desired. Meanwhile, the attacks by shadow creatures continued to increase in frequency and intensity. Liam could barely contain the situation, and fear began to spread among the population. One night, after a particularly intense day of training, Emily found Liam on the mansion's porch. He looked exhausted with deep circles under his eyes. How was the patrol? Emily asked, sitting down beside him. Liam sighed heavily. Difficult. We lost 2 blocks to the shadows today. We're being pushed back, Em. I don't know how much longer we can hold on. Emily felt a lump form in her throat. It's my fault, he whispered. If I hadn't absorbed that power... Hey, Liam interrupted her, holding her hand. You saved us all that night, and you're going to do it again. I know you will. Emily wanted to believe him, but doubts gnawed at her. What if I'm not strong enough? What if I lose myself to the shadows? Liam pulled her close, hugging her tightly. "That's not going to happen," he said with conviction. "Because you're not alone in this fight. I'll be by your side no matter what happens." At that moment, a scream cut through the night. Emily and Liam jumped up, running to the front of the mansion. What they saw left them paralyzed with horror. A huge rift had opened in the night sky, much larger than the one Emily had closed in Shadowgrove. From it, hordes of shadow creatures were emerging, descending upon the city like a storm of living darkness. Mrs. Winters appeared beside them, her face pale in the moonlight. "It has begun," she said gravely. The final battle. Emily felt the power of the shadows roar within her, responding to the presence of the creatures. She knew this was the moment she had trained for, the moment to face her destiny. "What should we do?" Liam asked, voice tense. Mrs. Winters looked directly at Emily. "You know what needs to be done, don't you?" Emily nodded slowly, the weight of responsibility falling on her shoulders. "I need to go to the source. Close the rift once and for all." "But that's suicide," Liam protested. "You can't face all of this alone." Emily turned to him, her eyes shining with a mixture of determination and fear. "I have no choice, Liam. I'm the only one who can do this." Mrs. Winters placed a hand on Emily's shoulder. "You won't really be alone, dear. Take this with you." She handed Emily an ancient amulet, glowing with ancestral power. "It will help you anchor yourself to this world, no matter how deeply dive into the shadows." Emily took the amulet, feeling its comforting warmth. She looked at Liam, seeing the fear and love in his eyes. "I'll come back," she promised. "You have to come back," Liam replied, his voice choked. "Because I'll be waiting for you." With one last look at her loved ones, Emily turned to the rift in the sky. Taking a deep breath, she let the power of the shadows flow through her. Her form began to dissolve into dark mist, and with a final thought of determination, she launched herself towards the battle that would decide the fate of two worlds. Emily rose towards the rift, her body now a mixture of shadow and light. As she approached, she could feel the pull of the other side. A realm of eternal darkness called to her. The shadow creatures surrounded her, some attacking, others retreating in confusion at her presence. Below, Liam and the other guardians fought desperately to contain the invasion. Liam diverted his attention for a moment, watching Emily ascend. "Come back to me," he whispered, before turning his attention back to the battle at hand. Upon reaching the edge of the rift, Emily hesitated. The power within her pulsed, yearning to join the darkness beyond. For a moment, she found herself tempted to simply surrender, to let herself be consumed by that infinite power. "No, Emily," Mrs. Winters' voice echoed in her mind. "Remember who you are, what you're fighting to protect." Emily pressed the amulet to her chest, feeling its warmth spread through her being. Images of Liam, Mrs. Winters, her city, and all those she loved flooded her mind. With a cry of determination, she plunged into the rift. When Emily dove into the rift, the world around her dissolved into a sensory nightmare. The air was dense and suffocating, with an acrid smell of decay. Tormented whispers echoed from all sides, some voices painfully familiar, distorted echoes of Liam, Mrs. Winters, even her parents. Forms writhed in the gloom, some vaguely humanoid, others completely alien. Tendrils of pure darkness brushed her skin, leaving trails of ice in her soul. And at the center of it all, Emily saw the source of the power. A vortex of pure shadow energy that pulsed like an evil heart. The shadow creature, when it materialized, was a living nightmare. Its eyes were abysses of dying stars, its form constantly shifting as if it couldn't decide which incarnate horror to be. When it spoke, its voice reverberated not just in the air, but in Emily's very mind, threatening to shatter her sanity. "You came." The voice resonated throughout the shadow realm. It was ancient, powerful, and laden with malice. The bridge between worlds, finally. Emily felt a shiver run through her being. "Who? What are you?" "I am what your kind has feared since the beginning of time, the primordial void, the eternal darkness." The creature extended what appeared to be a hand towards Emily. "Join me, child. Embrace your true potential. Together, we can bring eternal night to all worlds." Emily felt the power within her respond to the creature's call. Part of her wanted to yield, to surrender to that promise of unlimited power. But then she felt the warmth of the amulet, reminding her of everything she had left behind. "No," she said, her voice gaining strength. "I didn't come to join you. I came to end this." The conflict that followed was both physical and mental. Each attack by the creature was not just a wave of shadow energy, but an onslaught against Emily's very memories and hopes. He saw visions of a world consumed by darkness, of Liam and all those she loved transformed into servants of the shadows. The creature roared in fury, launching waves of shadow energy against Emily. She raised her hands, channeling her own power to create a barrier. The impact was tremendous, almost shattering her. "Fool," the creature bellowed. "You cannot defeat me. I am eternal." Emily staggered, feeling her controls slip. But then she heard, distant, almost inaudible, Liam's voice. "I believe in you, Em." With a cry of determination, Emily gathered all her power. She wouldn't fight against the darkness, she would embrace it, guide it. Extending her hands, she began to pull the energy from the vortex into herself. The shadow creature howled, feeling its power being drained. "What are you doing? Stop." But Emily resisted. With each onslaught, she clung more tightly to her memories, to the warmth of the amulet, to the promise she had made. When she finally channeled her power to absorb the essence of the Shadow Realm, it was not just an act of power, but of acceptance. Acceptance of her own inner darkness, and the responsibility of keeping it in balance with the light. "This ends now," Emily declared, her voice resonating with power. With one last monumental effort, she channeled all the energy she had absorbed. A wave of power exploded from her, sweeping through the Shadow Realm. The creature screamed one last time before being disintegrated by the light. The rift began to close, the reality of the Shadow Realm crumbling around her. Emily felt herself being pulled back to her own world. Something was wrong. Power she had absorbed was too much, too heavy to completely cross the barrier between worlds. "No," she cried, realizing what needed to be done. With one last look at the light of her world, Emily made her choice. She turned and plunged back into the darkness, using her newly acquired power to seal the rift behind her. The last thing Liam saw was a flash of intense light, and then nothing. Emily had disappeared. Years passed. The city, once tormented by shadows, flourished under an ever-clear sky. Glass and steel skyscrapers now dotted the horizon, reflecting the light of the sun and stars. Verdant parks replaced dark alleys, and the streets vibrated with the energy of a population that had learned not to fear the darkness. People moved on, but never forgot the sacrifice of the young woman who saved them. Liam, now an adult man, never lost hope. Every night, he looked to the stars, remembering Emily and the power she possessed. His face, once young and carefree, now carried lines of worry and responsibility, but his eyes still shone with the same determination as always. On an ordinary night, Liam was walking back home after a long day of work. The streets were quiet, illuminated by the soft glow of state-of-the-art streetlights. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows of an alley. Liam stopped, his heart racing as he recognized the face that had haunted his dreams for years. "Emily?" he whispered, hardly believing his eyes. She smiled, and Liam saw that time had left its marks on her too. Emily was older, but in a graceful and elegant way. Her hair, once deep black, now displayed silver streaks that shimmered under the moonlight. Soft lines framed her eyes and mouth, silent witnesses to the experiences lived. Still, she radiated a mature beauty and inner strength that made her even more impressive than in her youth. "Hello, Liam," he said, her voice deeper and richer than he remembered. "It's been a long time." Liam stepped forward, wanting to touch her, make sure she was real. Where have you been all these years?" Emily looked around, as if afraid of being overheard. For a moment, Liam swore he saw shadows moving unnaturally around them. "There's no time to explain everything now. Liam, I need your help." "Anything," Liam responded without hesitation, noticing how the years had transformed them, but not diminished the connection between them. Emily extended her hand to him. A strange mark, like a constellation of black stars, glowed on her palm. "The balance is threatened again. This time, I can't do it alone." Liam looked at Emily's outstretched hand, then back to her eyes. In them, he saw the weight of worlds he couldn't comprehend. But he also saw the woman that the girl he had loved had become. Without saying a word, he took her hand, feeling the familiar warmth and pulsing energy that always characterized her. And so, under the starry sky of a city long free from shadows, a new journey began. The city lights flickered for a moment, as if responding to an invisible force, reminding everyone that darkness is never far from light. So folks, what did you think of this intense journey between light and shadow? Emily made the ultimate sacrifice to save everyone, but her return raises many questions. What could have happened to her during all those years trapped between worlds? What new abilities or knowledge might she have acquired? And what could be threatening the balance again, after so long in peace? We really want to know your theories and opinions. Share in the comments what you imagine might have happened to Emily and what you expect to happen next in her and Liam's life. Your ideas might be more incredible than you imagine. If you got chills, were moved, or intrigued by this story, don't forget to leave your like. This helps us a lot to continue bringing quality content to you. And if you're not subscribed to the channel yet, what are you waiting for? Click the subscribe button right now and activate the bell to not miss any of our electrifying stories. Remember, the shadows might be closer than we imagine. Stay alert and see you next time.